This book contains names and stories of First Nations people who have passed on. At times, it also covers issues of a sensitive and traumatic nature. These are voluntarily shared by First Nations AA members active in recovery from alcoholism, using the 12 steps of AA and supporting others to do the same.
Anonymous, my story of hope. I am an alcoholic and sober today by the grace of God, the 12 steps, and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I picked up my first drink around the age of 13. I'd had an argument with my parents and I stole something red out of their liquor cabinet. I don't know what it was and it didn't taste very nice, but I put it in a drink bottle and took it up the driveway in the bush and drank it as quickly as I could to get drunk. Because even at that age, my concept of drinking was to get drunk, and that's pretty much how I spent the rest of my drinking career. I grew up in a pretty good home environment and played a lot of sport, so I know I cannot blame my parents or my upbringing for my drinking and troublesome ways. My parents were strict and warned me against drinking. I was not allowed out much in my teenage years, probably for good reason, looking back. And so when I drank, it was not for social purposes. I drank for the effect of alcohol. Early on, I drank and got so sick I would vomit, even in public. A normal person would drink and think maybe they'd had enough. Not me, I could just not wait to drink again. I started smoking pot in pretty much the same way. When I was 16, I left home, and by the time I was 19, I was an intravenous drug addict, addicted to meth, and 35 kilos, homeless, and had psychosis. Drugs are just part of my story. I had been arrested once for just about everything and was of unsound mind to answer those charges. The police eventually arrested me in a stolen car and dropped me off at the mental institution where I was involuntarily admitted and pumped full of anti-psych medication and antidepressants. I hated the feeling of being medicated and out of control of what drugs were administered to me. When my head started to clear, they shipped me off to rehab on a court order, where I would stay for 6 months until I could answer to the charges against me. In rehab, I remember having my first experience of meetings. There were a lot of people, but I don't really remember hearing the message. I ended up getting kicked out of rehab after 3 months for anger management issues, because part of group therapy was sitting around in a circle and people would tell me things that were wrong with me or make suggestions on how I could change my behaviour. And I've never really liked hearing any of that. I could never take any constructive criticism. I was full of anger, resentment, self-pity, and terminal self-concern. And so I left rehab only to get picked up by the police and taken back because I was there on a court order. I did another 3 months in rehab and got kicked out again for anger management issues. By then, my court stuff had started to be resolved, and so I was able to leave rehab and go back to my hometown. On the way out the door, they suggested that I should continue going to meetings if I could. And so when I got home, I visited a local AA meeting. I heard this lady talking about how her and her husband were ex-heroin addicts and had gotten clean and sober in AA. They had their kids with them and had 10 years of good sobriety and clean time and were happy about it. When this lady shared her experience, strength, and hope with me, it was the first time I really remember someone talking about the disease of alcoholism and how it centers in the mind. This lady talked about the fear and the shame and remorse that comes with active alcoholism and addiction. I related to her straight away. She explained that when she was sick with this disease, she did not even want to leave the house to get the mail out of a letterbox for fear that someone would see her or recognize her. She said she could not look people in the eye. I related to that straight away. She spoke about being irritable, restless, and discontent, and how it is part of the disease. I was to learn that alcoholism is not about the drinking. It is about the thinking. When an alcoholic picks up a drink, alcohol gives a temporary reprieve from those discomforts. Well, I had spent my whole life feeling different and apart from the rest of the world. After years of using and drinking alcoholically, I felt like a piece of dirt under somebody's shoe. I always felt uncomfortable in my skin, even as a kid. I had spent a great deal of my life thinking it was because I was Aboriginal, and there were not too many Aboriginal people in the town I grew up in. I thought that's why I felt different, to be honest. I come from grassroots mob, but had grown up away from my people. I spent a lot of my life feeling like I was not black enough or white enough. My mother was part of the stolen generation, as was her mother. My family had suffered greatly at the hands of colonisation. I would come to understand in the years following how the history of our country had directly impacted my family and my mother in particular, her ability to care for me. I was full of resentment and distrust. I felt that stuff on a cellular level, and those rivers ran deep with me. I had an axe to grind and a good excuse to grind it. And so I related to the bad feelings that this lady in AA spoke of. But then the lady went on to talk about how she had come into AA and done the 12 steps and had a spiritual experience as a result of doing so. She had recovered from life and the disease of alcoholism and addiction. She shared a simple message and talked about a God of her own understanding. I heard another person in AA say it did not matter if God was a Coke can on top of the fridge. It can be whatever you like, so long as you have an acceptance and believe that there is something outside of you that can help, so long as you can have faith in it. Some in the meeting said it was the meeting itself that they placed their faith in, but all used the word God, as it was written in the Big Book. It amazed me to realize that I had been praying silently to something for a long time before I got there. I had just enough faith to get me out of a daily scrape, but nothing more. For me, at the time, I was 20 years old, still full of enough hot air to sail my own ship. I had managed to get some clean time up from drugs. I hung around for a month or two, but remember thinking drugs were my problem, not alcohol. And so I left and never went back to a meeting for 10 years. I spent the next 10 years really trying hard to moderate and regulate my drinking. I was a vodka drinker mostly, and they say this disease is progressive if left untreated. Well, my drinking got worse. And even though I had managed to get clean off the needle, if I were drunk enough, I would go looking for drugs too. I lived my life according to my crazy alcoholic thinking and spent the entire time chasing the relief of that first drink. If insanity is the definition of going back and doing the same thing with the expectation of a different outcome, then I lived it. I had no defense against alcohol or drugs, despite my best efforts. In my drinking, the blackouts got worse, and my behaviour was worse. I would kid myself that because I could manage the rent and a job and keep my car registered, that I was doing okay. But often I would come home with no money and bruises that I could never explain. I once came home with a tattoo on my butt that I have no memory of getting. I did not discover it until the next afternoon when the grog was wearing off and it started to hurt, and I checked myself in the mirror. Sometimes, more than not, I would wake up in strange places with the horrors and not know how I got there or how to get home. I was forever losing phones and licenses and things of value. I lived and worked in a large city. I once went out on a Friday night after work with the best intentions to only have a couple of drinks. I parked my car in a bus lane that was closed for the night. I got drunk and ended up clubbing in a 24-hour nightclub for 2 days. When I came out of the club, I had to go and get my car from a council compound yard. It had been towed away so the bus lane could be reopened. I was always doing stupid stuff like that. I could never get my shit together. And I was very lonely and always unhappy, despite having plenty of friends and being surrounded by people. And I could never go for more than a couple of days without picking up that next drink. I tried everything to be a better person. I had good jobs, made good money. I moved to all 4 corners of the country, changed what I wear, where I work, what I drink, who I drink with. I was always blaming others. If I could just stay away from them, I will be okay. Nothing worked. When I was 26, I took a hostage, as they say, and fell pregnant with my first child. And honestly, that was going to be the final frontier for me. The next thing to make me better. I really thought parenthood would be the thing to pull me into line. I would be respectable and my life would settle down. I would have a house and 2 cars, a vegetable garden, a rainwater tank and chooks, and a white picket fence. And though I went on to get what I wanted, it still was not enough. My dysfunctional drinking continued. I had small children and wanted to be a good parent, but had absolutely no idea on how to do that. I had spent my whole adult life thinking only of myself and the power to carry that out. How was I going to look after these little humans? I was forever chastising my kid's father and attacking him for his drinking. Our extended family were big drinkers, and I blamed them for their drinking and how it affected my family. I always thought that if other people would only do as I say, then everything around me would be better. I always felt that things would be better without alcohol. I never realised at the time that if only I would quit drinking, everything would be okay. My last drink was on a Sunday night, and I had kicked my children's father out again and tipped all his beer down the sink. I had palmed my kids off to my mum, and I sat at the back door at home, drinking, alone, depressed, drunk, ringing people who probably did not really want to talk to me. I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I swore off it one more time. Wednesday came around and I had not picked up a drink, but the fear had set in. Anxiety gripped me because I knew deep down I could never go for more than 3 or 4 days without a drink. And it had been 3 days. For some reason, AA popped into my head. I looked the number up in the phone book and called. There was a meeting on at lunchtime and I went to it. It was 10 years since I had been to a meeting, and it was the same meeting that I was going back to. When I got there, the lady I had heard and related to all those years before was still there. She and her husband were still there, as well as many others. So I knew they must be doing something that worked. Everybody was another 10 years clean and sober and were still happy about it. Straight away I had hope, and there was a chance I could do what they have done and find a way to live sober and have a happy life without alcohol. I got a sponsor, somebody who could take me through the book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps. I bought an AA book, the big book. I joined the group and did service, and people said, just keep coming back. And so I did. I did 3 meetings a week. We are fortunate in AA nowadays to be able to do meetings across the internet if we can't make it to a meeting in person, or if there aren't enough meetings in our town. I heard a lot of suggestions in AA because there are a lot of well-meaning people, but I came to learn that if it is not in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it is not AA. I never had a relationship in AA because I heard it was like going to the wreckers for a new car. I have since met plenty of long-term sober members who met in AA who are happily in relationships. But for my early sobriety, this served as a good suggestion on how to stay focused on my program. I learnt and experienced unconditional love in my home group and the fellowship. I never knew there was even such a thing before I came to AA. People around me in my community and my home continued to drink, but it didn't matter. I got sober with alcohol in my fridge. This has been the power of God and AA in my life. I got 8 years of good, clean sobriety up. I became the parent who was sober and present for my children and their needs. And I got to be that sober auntie in my family and community who did not drink, no matter what everyone else was doing. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous is such a cleverly written manual, a list of instructions, and it gave me the practical tools on how to get sober and stay sober. It is written in Old English from a distant time, but the principles never change. It is a complete design for living and a practical solution to all my problems. It is so successful that other groups such as NA, Narcotics Anonymous, GA, Gamblers Anonymous, EA, Emotions Anonymous, and a host of other fellowships have sprung up based on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. In the end, though, for me, it started with alcohol and finished with alcohol. Though I have had trouble with all those other things over the years, once I got sober and stayed sober and continued to practice sobriety, I recovered from life and everything in between. By the grace of God, I was able to be a contributing, relatively normal member of society. However, in 2019, I stopped going to meetings. Alcoholism is such a cunning, baffling, and powerful disease. It had snuck up on me. I stopped practicing the solution, stopped going to meetings, and I stopped doing the steps. And, of course, my thinking started to revert to its old ways. And because of this, again, I picked up a drink. 8 good years of sobriety down the drain. I drank for another 1.5 years after that. And I can safely say it was not any better than it had been the last time. And I continued to kid myself again that because I was working, paying the rent, looking after the kids, that I was doing okay. In the big book, the mental obsession is described here. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. The shoe fit. I was miserable, broke, and my relationships were in a bad way. I was also beginning to feel very physically unwell. It was especially difficult to parent from this space. I held out for as long as I could, but knowing what I knew of AA and how good it had been to be continually sober for all those years, I finally came back into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous in Easter of this year. There is something different about talking to other recovering or recovered alcoholics. They understand what it is like to have suffered the horrendousness of alcoholism and all that it entails. When I was much younger, I sought help in so many ways. I went to churches and Buddhist temples, spoke to counselors and psychologists, did yoga, tried cognitive therapists and acupuncture, and attempted to read self-help books. All these things were wonderful experiences, but they did not help me to stay sober. As well-intentioned as organisations and institutions are, and the big book covers this in the first chapter, I never experienced anything like what I did when I walked into the doors of AA and talked to another alcoholic who had recovered through the big book and the 12 steps of AA. The AA fellowship loved me back to health. When I share my experiences of drinking in meetings, sometimes people laughed, and I wondered, how could they laugh at such devastating things? And then I was to learn it is because they went through the same things and can now look back sober and know it is just alcoholism and it is possible to recover from that. Today, I'm nearly 5 months sober again and happily doing service in my home group and talking regularly to other alcoholics. I live in a town where there is a high density of First Nations people, and I see what alcoholism does to our community and families. I have also experienced it firsthand. I'm always happy to see other mob in meetings, but I always pray that still more will come to the fellowship. I no longer carry that large chip on my shoulder about my identity or anything else. I know that today, resentment is the number one killer of alcoholics. Through this program, I've been able to let go of the past and gained hope for a better future for my children, my family, and community. reconciliation ended up being an inside job for me, and my identity is not determined by any structure, organisation, policy, or legislation, and it has in fact given me an even stronger sense of spiritual connection to my ancestors. Being a sober parent to my beautiful children is one of the greatest gifts of my sobriety. I know I cannot stop life from happening and they must walk their own paths, but I am glad they know that they have a choice. In the beginning, I thought I came to AA to stop drinking, but after getting sober and staying sober and having a better life, I realised it was peace I was seeking. I learned to be responsible and to do what is in front of me, and one day at a time. I have been able to have peace around people, places, and things that used to drive me to insanity. This is the first time I've ever shared my story publicly. I am a firm believer that the magic of AA and passing the message of the 12 steps happens when one alcoholic talks to another. And so I humbly go about doing this in regular meetings. Being honest, talking to newcomers, and sharing my story keeps me sober. My story is all I've got, and I hope one day you will have the courage to tell yours.